Well, that was easier than I thought it would be, honestly. I was worried she might put up more of a fight, but I guess she finally understands that this is what's best for both of us. The sound of Blake Crawford's voice filled the silent courtroom like poison spreading through water, each word deliberate and cutting, as he leaned over to his expensive attorney with that platinum blonde hair catching the fluorescent lights overhead, looking every bit the successful architect he'd spent 9 years convincing me to help him become while I slowly disappeared into the background of my own life. I watched from across the mahogany table as my husband signed our divorce papers with the same casual indifference he'd shown when signing grocery lists or permission slips or the mortgage documents that put our house entirely in his name. Because married couples should trust each other completely, shouldn't they? And I'd trusted him with everything, including my entire financial future, which was about to become my biggest mistake or my greatest salvation, depending on what happened in the next 30 minutes. Blake's attorney, Garrison Powers, was exactly the type of lawyer you'd expect a man like Blake to hire, all slicked-back hair and expensive cologne, and the kind of smile that suggested he'd sold his soul years ago and gotten a very good price for it. And together they made quite the pair, sitting there in their matching navy suits that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past 3 years combined. My own lawyer, Miss Elena Vasquez, sat beside me with her kind eyes and worn briefcase and the tired expression of someone who'd fought too many losing battles for women who couldn't afford the good attorneys. And I could see in her face that she thought this was going to be another one of those battles until about 20 minutes ago, when everything changed in ways that Blake couldn't possibly imagine. Judge Diane Morrison sat behind her bench looking stern and professional with her reading glasses perched on her nose, and I could see the disapproval in her expression every time Blake made one of his loud comments to Garrison about how generous he was being to me, how I should be grateful that he wasn't leaving me with nothing, even though that's exactly what he'd planned to do before fate and my father's carefully laid plans intervened. In the back row seat number 7, I could see Paige Sinclair trying to look inconspicuous in her red dress and designer heels. My replacement, Blake's secretary turned mistress, turned future wife. If his plans had worked out the way he'd expected them to, and the irony wasn't lost on me that the woman he was leaving me for was sitting right there watching him try to destroy my life like it was some kind of entertainment. Garrison Powers stood up with the kind of theatrical flourish that probably worked well in corporate boardrooms, but seemed almost obscene in a courtroom where a woman's entire future was being decided, and he began presenting Blake's idea of a fair settlement with the enthusiasm of someone describing an act of charity rather than the legal minimum he was required to offer after 9 years of marriage. According to the documents he spread across the table with exaggerated care, I would receive the house that Blake and I had purchased together 5 years ago, which sounded generous, until you remembered that the mortgage was underwater by $40,000. Because Blake had refinanced it 3 times to fund his business expansion, without ever consulting me about whether that was a good idea, and I would also get our 10-year-old Toyota Camry that needed new brakes and had a check engine light that had been on for 6 months, because we supposedly couldn't afford to fix it even though Blake had just bought himself a Mercedes SUV that he parked in the garage like a trophy. The monthly alimony payment of $1,800 was presented as if Blake was doing me some enormous favor, as if that amount would somehow cover the mortgage payment and utilities and food and health insurance and all the other expenses of existing in the world as a single woman with no job, because my husband had convinced me years ago that it would be better for his career if I stayed home and supported his ambitions instead of pursuing my own dreams of running a graphic design business. Blake would keep his thriving architectural firm that was apparently worth exactly $800,000, according to the valuation he'd provided, even though I knew for a fact that he'd landed a $3 million contract with the city just last month and had been celebrating by taking Paige to expensive restaurants that he told me we couldn't afford when I suggested we go out for our anniversary. He would also keep the vacation property in the mountains that was titled only in his name, even though I'd spent 3 summers helping him renovate it with my own hands, and his retirement accounts that had somehow accumulated $800,000. even though he was always telling me we needed to be careful with money and the Mercedes and the boat that he'd bought last year for fishing trips that always seemed to coincide with Paige needing to work late on presentations. Blake leaned over to Garrison loud enough for me and Miss Vasquez to hear perfectly, his platinum blonde hair falling across his forehead in that way he probably practiced in the mirror, and said with a smirk that made my stomach turn, "I almost feel bad for her walking away with so little after all these years. But then I remember how she never really contributed to building any of this anyway. So maybe it's actually more than fair." And Paige actually giggled from her seat in the back row like this was all some kind of joke instead of the destruction of another woman's life. Judge Morrison was reaching for her gavel, her expression suggesting she was about as impressed with Blake's performance as I was when Miss Vasquez suddenly stood up with a decisiveness I hadn't seen from her before, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the court in a way that made everyone in the room sit up a little straighter and pay attention. "Your Honor, if I may. There is one matter we need to address before finalizing these proceedings, a matter regarding Mrs. Crawford's inheritance from her late father that has only recently come to light due to some administrative complications at the probate court that delayed the proper processing of his estate." Blake's smirk faltered for just a moment, replaced by confusion and then a flicker of something that might have been concern before his arrogance reasserted itself, and he actually laughed out loud in a way that echoed off the courtroom walls. "What inheritance are we talking about here?" "Your Honor, because I hate to break it to everyone, but Maya's father was a custodian who worked the night shift cleaning office buildings, and he died 6 years ago, leaving her maybe a few $1,000s that she spent on his funeral. So unless we're counting his collection of cleaning supplies as valuable assets, I'm not sure what kind of inheritance could possibly be relevant to these proceedings." The casual cruelty in the way he said custodian like my father's honest work was something to be ashamed of. Like the man who raised me single-handedly after my mother died and made sure I got through college and always had everything I needed, was somehow less valuable than Blake's architect father, who'd handed him a trust fund and connections, made my hands curl into fists under the table where no one could see them shaking. Judge Morrison leaned forward with an expression of genuine interest, now her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she looked at Ms. Vasquez with raised eyebrows that suggested this development was unexpected, even for someone who'd probably seen everything in her years on the bench. "What kind of inheritance are we discussing, Ms. Vasquez, and why is this the first time it's being mentioned in these proceedings?" Ms. Vasquez pulled a thick folder from her briefcase with the kind of careful precision that suggested she knew exactly how explosive the contents were going to be. And I felt my heart pounding in my chest because even though she'd explained some of this to me yesterday, I still couldn't quite believe it was real. Couldn't quite accept that my father had been protecting me all along in ways I never imagined possible. 6 months earlier, my life looked perfect from the outside. Or at least that's what I told myself every morning when I woke up in our beautiful house in Westchester with its cathedral ceilings and granite countertops and the kind of kitchen that appeared in home design magazines. All of it paid for by Blake's increasingly successful architectural firm, while I spent my days working on occasional freelance graphic design projects that brought in maybe $1,200 a month, if I was lucky barely enough to cover groceries and the small personal expenses that Blake said I should handle myself, since he was taking care of all the big bills. Our marriage had settled into a comfortable routine that felt less like partnership and more like I was playing the role of supportive wife in a play that Blake was directing, and I'd gotten so good at the performance that sometimes I forgot there'd been a time when I had my own dreams and ambitions beyond making sure his clients were impressed by our dinner parties and his shirts were pressed perfectly for important meetings. Blake's firm, Crawford and Associates, had grown from a 2-person operation when we got married to a staff of 15 architects and designers working on projects all over the tri-state area. And I was proud of what he'd accomplished, even though it meant he was working late almost every night and traveling frequently for site visits and client meetings that seemed to multiply the more successful he became. Our 9th wedding anniversary came and went without Blake even remembering until I mentioned it 3 days later, and he'd apologized with that charming smile that had first attracted me to him back in college and promised to make it up to me with a special dinner on the weekend. But the weekend came and went, and he had an emergency meeting with a client in Connecticut that couldn't be rescheduled. And I told myself that this was just what marriage looked like when you were building something important, that the sacrifice and loneliness were temporary conditions that would improve once the business was more established. I spent that particular Tuesday making Blake's favorite meal, lamb chops with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes. The same dinner I'd made for our first anniversary when we were still living in a tiny apartment and dreaming about the future we were going to build together. And I set the table with candles and our good wine glasses, thinking maybe we could recreate some of that early magic if I just tried hard enough to be the wife he needed me to be. Blake came home at 11 that night, and I could hear him on the phone in the driveway before he even came inside. His voice animated and happy in a way it hadn't sounded when talking to me in months. And when he finally walked through the door, he barely glanced at the cold dinner waiting on the table before kissing the top of my head absently and heading upstairs to take a shower, leaving me sitting there alone, wondering when exactly I'd become so invisible in my own marriage. The signs had been there for months, if I'd been willing to see them. Blake's increasing secrecy about his phone, the way he angled the screen away from me when texts came in, how he'd started password protecting his laptop, even though we'd always shared everything openly before, or at least I thought we had. But I'd convinced myself that successful people needed privacy for their work, that I was being paranoid and insecure to question whether my husband was being honest with me about where he spent his time and who he spent it with. Looking back now, I can see how deliberately he'd isolated me, how carefully he'd positioned me as someone who didn't understand business or finance or the real world beyond our suburban bubble. Someone whose opinions on important matters weren't really worth considering, because I'd given up my career to support his, and somehow that decision he'd encouraged me to make had transformed in his mind into evidence of my lack of ambition rather than my commitment to our partnership. That Tuesday evening, when everything changed, started like dozens of other evenings before it, with Blake calling around 5:30 to say he'd be working late again, his voice sounding rushed and slightly breathless as he explained that he and Paige, his new secretary, who'd been with the firm for about a year, were working on a really important presentation for a potential client, and they needed to get everything perfect before the meeting the next morning. I'd met Paige a few times at company events, a blonde woman in her late 20s who was friendly and professional and always seemed to remember everyone's names and personal details in that way that made you feel special, even though you knew she probably did it with everyone. And I'd actually been grateful that Blake had someone so competent helping him manage his increasingly complicated schedule, never suspecting that her efficiency extended to helping him plan the destruction of our marriage. Something about that particular phone call felt different, though maybe it was the way Blake's voice softened when he said Paige's name, or the slight hesitation before he told me not to wait up for him, or just the accumulation of months of distance and disconnection finally reaching a breaking point in my subconscious. But whatever it was, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to surprise Blake and Paige with dinner at the office, thinking maybe if I showed up with food and support, it might remind him of the early days when we were a team working toward shared goals. And I carefully packed the lamb chops and vegetables into a casserole dish, added a salad and some bread, and drove the 30 minutes into downtown where Blake's office occupied the entire 3rd floor of a converted warehouse building that he was always talking about buying someday when the firm was more established. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived around 8, just Blake's Mercedes and a red convertible that I recognized as Paige's car, and I felt a small flutter of unease in my stomach that I pushed down because surely there was nothing wrong with a boss and his secretary working late on an important project. This was just me being paranoid again, letting my insecurities get the better of my common sense. I used my key code to enter through the main entrance, balancing the warm casserole dish and the bag of salad and bread as I made my way to the elevator, and the building felt strange and empty in that way that office buildings do. After hours, all the fluorescent lights dimmed and the normal bustle of activity replaced by an almost eerie silence, broken only by the hum of the heating system. The elevator ride to the third floor seemed to take forever, and I found myself getting more excited about surprising Blake, imagining his face when he saw that I'd brought his favorite meal to help him get through the long night of work, picturing how we might eat together in his office and talk about our days like we used to do when we first got married and actually enjoyed each other's company. The elevator doors opened onto Blake's floor, and I immediately noticed that most of the office lights were off except for the glow coming from Blake's corner office at the far end of the space, and I could hear voices drifting across the empty desks and filing cabinets. Blake's deep laugh that I recognized instantly because it was the real laugh he used when he was genuinely amused, not the polite professional laugh he used with clients, and something about that laugh made me slow down and approach more quietly than I'd originally intended. I was maybe 20 feet from Blake's office, hidden behind a partition wall near the copy machines, when I heard Paige's voice, low and intimate and playful, in a way that made every muscle in my body tense up as she said, "You're terrible. What if someone comes in and catches us like this? What would we even say?" And Blake's response came immediately, confident and unconcerned. "Nobody's coming in. It's after 8 on a Tuesday night, and everyone else has lives to go home to. Besides, I pay the rent on this whole floor, so I should be able to do whatever I want here without worrying about who might walk in." The casual possessiveness in his voice, the way he said "whatever I want," sent chills down my spine, because I knew with absolute certainty what I was about to hear, what I'd been refusing to acknowledge for months, because accepting it would mean accepting that my entire marriage had been built on foundations that were crumbling beneath my feet. Blake came home that night at midnight, whistling cheerfully as he walked through the door, and I was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, having thrown the entire casserole dish of lamb chops and vegetables into the trash can, because I couldn't bear to look at it anymore. Couldn't stand the reminder of how naive I'd been to think that bringing my husband dinner would solve anything when the real problem was that he didn't want to be married to me anymore and was actively planning his escape while I cooked his favorite meals and pressed his shirts and played the role of devoted wife. He found me in the darkness and kissed the top of my head with the same casual affection he'd shown for months, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd just spent the last 3 hours listening to him tell another woman that I was the situation he needed to manage, that my lack of ambition held him back from achieving his full potential, that divorcing me would be easy because I had no idea about his offshore accounts, or the real value of his business, or any of the careful financial positioning he'd been doing for the past 18 months to ensure I walked away with as little as possible. Every fiber of my being wanted to confront him right there in our kitchen, to scream and cry and demand explanations for how the man I'd loved and supported for 9 years could be so cruel and calculating. But something deeper and more primal than my anger took over, some survival instinct that told me knowledge was power and surprise was a weapon, and if I showed my hand now before I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with, I would lose whatever small advantage I might have in the war that was clearly coming, whether I wanted it or not. So instead, I turned on the light and smiled at Blake and asked about his presentation and listened to him lie to my face about working with Paige on spreadsheets and architectural renderings. And I made appropriate sympathetic noises about how hard he was working and how proud I was of his dedication. And the whole time I was performing this charade of the supportive wife, I could feel something inside me turning cold and hard and determined in ways I'd never experienced before. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life, waking up every morning next to a man who was actively planning to betray me, and acting like everything was fine, making breakfast and coffee and small talk about his day, while knowing that he spent his lunches with Paige planning their future together, and his evenings moving money into accounts he thought I didn't know existed. I spent those weeks researching divorce lawyers in private browsing windows that I cleared immediately after each session, calling from payphones because I didn't trust that Blake wasn't monitoring my cell phone usage, and finally finding Ms. Elena Vasquez through an online support group for women facing financial abuse in divorce, which was apparently what Blake's careful asset hiding was called in legal terms, even though to me it just felt like the ultimate betrayal by someone who was supposed to love and protect me. Vasquez's office was nothing like the sleek glass tower where Blake's attorney probably worked, just a small suite in an older building downtown with worn carpet and metal filing cabinets, and the kind of waiting room furniture that had seen better days. But when she sat down across from me with her kind eyes and genuinely sympathetic expression, and asked me to tell her everything, I felt safer than I had in months, because here, finally, was someone who believed me, and wasn't trying to make me feel crazy for thinking my husband might be lying to me. I told her about overhearing Blake and Paige about the offshore accounts and hidden assets they'd discussed so casually about 9 years of marriage that was apparently worth nothing to a man who valued money and status more than the vows we'd made to each other, and Ms. Vasquez listened to every word while taking careful notes, and occasionally shaking her head in that way that suggested she'd heard similar stories too many times before. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before looking up at me with an expression that mixed compassion with a kind of grim realism that I would come to appreciate in the months ahead. And she said very gently that my case was going to be difficult because Blake had clearly been planning this divorce for a long time and had positioned his assets in ways that would be extremely hard to challenge, especially since I had no independent income and no access to the kind of legal resources that Blake could afford with his successful business and hidden offshore accounts. She explained that in cases like mine, where one spouse had all the financial power and the other had been systematically excluded from understanding or controlling the marital finances, the courts often sided with the more powerful spouse simply because they had better lawyers and better documentation and could afford to drag things out until the weaker spouse ran out of money and had to accept whatever settlement was offered just to survive. But I have to ask Ms. Vasquez said, leaning forward with sudden interest. Do you have any family who might be able to help you? Any assets of your own separate from the marriage? Any inheritance or trust fund or anything that might give you some financial foundation to fight from? And I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I shook my head and explained that my mother had died when I was 11 and my father had passed away 6 years ago from a sudden heart attack that took him before I'd even had a chance to say goodbye. And he'd left me a modest savings account of maybe $8,000 that I'd used to pay for his funeral and settle his small debts. Nothing that could possibly help me fight against a man who had millions hidden in accounts around the world. My father, Dominic Winters, had been a night custodian at a downtown office complex for as long as I could remember, coming home in the early morning hours after I'd already left for school and sleeping during the day while I was in class, and our relationship had been built around the precious few hours we had together in the evenings. Before he had to leave for his shift hours, he filled with homework, help, and life advice and stories about my mother, who he said would have been so proud of the woman I was becoming. He worked multiple jobs to make sure I had everything I needed, fixing cars in our apartment parking lot on weekends and doing handyman work for neighbors, always busy and always tired, but never too tired to make sure I knew I was loved and valued and capable of achieving anything I set my mind to, regardless of what anyone else might tell me about my worth or potential. I remembered being young and seeing men in expensive suits come to our modest apartment for meetings with my father sitting at our small kitchen table drinking coffee while I watched cartoons in the next room. And I'd asked him once what those meetings were about, and he'd just smiled and ruffled my hair and said they were talking about business stuff that I didn't need to worry about, that my only job was to focus on school and being a kid and letting him handle the grown-up concerns. There had been something in the way those men treated my father, a respect and deference that seemed at odds with his position as a janitor. But I'd been too young to understand what it meant, and by the time I was old enough to ask more sophisticated questions, those meetings had stopped happening. Or at least stopped happening where I could see them. When I started dating Blake in college, my father had been polite but reserved in a way that bothered me at the time because I wanted him to love Blake as much as I did wanted his approval and blessing for the relationship that I was sure would lead to marriage and the kind of partnership I'd always dreamed about. Dominic never said anything directly critical about Blake, never told me not to marry him or suggested that he saw warning signs I was missing. But there was something in the way he watched Blake during family dinners, something in the questions he asked about Blake's plans and ambitions and views on marriage that suggested he had concerns. He wasn't quite willing to voice to his daughter, who was clearly head over heels in love. The last real conversation I had with my father before he died was about a month before his heart attack, and he'd taken my hands across the kitchen table in his apartment and looked at me with unusual seriousness as he said, "Maya, baby girl, I need you to promise me something. I need you to promise that you'll always keep your own money, your own accounts with just your name on them, that you'll never let anyone make you completely dependent on them financially, no matter how much you love them or trust them." I'd laughed and told him he was being old-fashioned, that Blake and I were partners, and partners shared everything that keeping separate finances suggested a lack of trust that had no place in a healthy marriage. And my father had sighed and squeezed my hands and said, "Just promise me you'll remember what I said. Remember that having your own resources isn't about not trusting your husband. It's about trusting yourself enough to know you can survive anything life throws at you." Ms. Vasquez's suggestion that I go through my father's belongings looking for anything that might help my case seemed like a desperate long shot. But desperation was pretty much all I had left at that point, so I found myself in our basement late one night after Blake had texted to say he was working late again, pulling out the boxes of Dominic's things that I'd packed hastily 6 years ago, and then never had the courage to really examine, because the grief was too fresh and the memories too painful. The boxes smelled like my father's apartment, a mixture of coffee and Old Spice, and something indefinably him that brought tears to my eyes as I started unpacking years of accumulated memories and documents and personal items that told the story of a man I was beginning to realize I hadn't fully understood, even though I'd loved him with my whole heart. At first, it was exactly what I expected to find: old wedding photos of my parents looking impossibly young and happy. My father's janitorial uniforms still in dry cleaning bags, tax returns showing modest income from his custodian job and side work, birthday cards I'd made him as a child decorated with crayon drawings and crooked handwriting declaring him the best daddy in the world. But then I found things that didn't make sense: business cards from companies I'd never heard of with names like Winters Development Group and Metro Properties LLC, and some of those business cards had my father's name printed on them, not as an employee but as a partner or principal, which seemed impossible because he was a janitor. He cleaned offices and fixed leaking faucets and changed light bulbs. He wasn't the kind of person who had business cards printed with his name in embossed lettering. The receipts I found next were even more confusing: purchases of expensive equipment and legal consultations and architectural surveys, payments to attorneys and accountants and financial advisors, amounts that seemed incomprehensible for someone who I thought made maybe $40,000 a year cleaning buildings and doing odd jobs. There were partnership agreements showing Dominic Winters as holding 30% ownership in something called Metro Properties, LLC, and bank statements from accounts I'd never known existed showing monthly deposits of $10,000, $25,000, even $50,000 going back years. Regular payments that suggested this wasn't occasional income, but rather consistent cash flow from investments or businesses that I'd had no idea my father was involved in. My hands were shaking as I pulled out a leather-bound appointment book that covered the last 3 years of my father's life, and flipping through the pages showed a schedule that was far more complex than I'd ever imagined: meetings with attorneys and real estate developers and business partners, scheduled around his janitorial shifts with the precision of someone who was living 2 completely different lives simultaneously. There was an entry from 8 months before his death that made my blood run cold: meeting with Harrison and partners. Ramaya's future. Must ensure everything is positioned correctly in case anything happens to me before she's ready. At the bottom of the last box, I found a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my father's careful handwriting, and something about seeing those familiar loops and curves after 6 years of grief made my chest tighten until I could barely breathe as I carefully opened the envelope and pulled out several pages of letter-weight paper covered in the same handwriting that had signed my report cards and birthday cards, and the note he'd left me the last morning of his life saying he'd see me for dinner and we'd celebrate my new promotion at work. My dearest Maya. The letter began, and I could hear my father's voice so clearly in those words that it felt like he was sitting right beside me in that basement, surrounded by his belongings. If you're reading this letter, it means you've finally found these boxes and decided to go through them, which probably means you're facing some kind of crisis or hardship that has forced you to look for resources you didn't know you had. And while I'm sorry that you're going through something difficult, I'm also relieved that my planning is finally coming to light at the moment when you need it most. The letter went on to explain a life I'd never known. My father lived how he'd started as a janitor straight out of high school after my mother got pregnant with me and they needed steady income and health insurance. But how he'd always been watching and listening and learning during those nights cleaning office buildings, observing how businesses operated, understanding what made some companies successful and others fail, gathering intelligence about the commercial real estate market and investment opportunities that most people in his position would never have access to or think to pursue. He described how people treated janitors like they were invisible, talking freely in front of him about confidential business deals and financial strategies and upcoming developments, assuming that the man emptying their trash cans couldn't possibly understand or benefit from the information they were so carelessly revealing. I started small. My father wrote saving every extra dollar I could from my side jobs and putting it into real estate partnerships with people who knew I was a custodian, but respected my business sense enough to take me seriously as an investor. And over 30 years, those small investments grew into something substantial. Something I always planned to tell you about when the time was right. But then I kept waiting for you to be older, more established, more ready to handle the responsibility of wealth. And I realized I was making a mistake. Because the real reason I wasn't telling you was that I wanted you to build your own life based on your own merit and choices, not on the security of knowing you had millions of dollars waiting for you someday. He explained that he had deliberately lived modestly kept working his custodian job even after he could have retired wealthy because he wanted to stay grounded and keep gathering the intelligence that made him such a successful investor, and because he wanted me to grow up understanding the value of hard work and humility rather than developing the sense of entitlement that often came with inherited wealth. But the part of the letter that made me cry so hard I could barely read the rest was where he wrote about Blake, about how he'd had my husband investigated 3 years into our marriage, because something about Blake's ambition and the way he talked about my career made Dominic uneasy, made him worry that I'd chosen a partner who saw me as an asset to be managed rather than an equal to be cherished. I have evidence of things that might break your heart, Maya, but I've left it with my attorneys because I don't want to be the one who destroys your marriage. If you're happy, I don't want to take away your agency to make your own choices about your life and your relationships. But if Blake ever tries to hurt you or take advantage of you or leave you vulnerable, then all the documentation you need to protect yourself will be waiting for you, along with resources that will ensure you never have to depend on anyone for your security or your sense of self-worth. The letter ended with instructions to contact Harrison and Partners, a law firm downtown, and included keys to safe deposit boxes and account numbers, and a final message that I would carry with me forever. You are my greatest investment. Maya, not because of the money I'm leaving you, but because of the woman you've become, despite my worrying that hiding my success from you might somehow damage you. You are strong and kind and capable and deserving of everything good this world has to offer. And if someone has convinced you otherwise, if someone has made you feel small or insignificant or less than the remarkable person I know you to be, then use these resources to remind yourself and everyone else that you are Dominic Winter's daughter, and that means something. That means you come from strength and intelligence and determination that has been building for generations, and no one has the right to take that away from you." I called Harrison and Partners the next morning as soon as their office opened, my hands still shaking from a sleepless night spent reading my father's letter over and over, while Blake slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that his carefully constructed plan to leave me with nothing was about to collide with resources and protection he'd never imagined possible. The receptionist who answered sounded almost relieved when I gave my name, saying, "Ms. Winters, we've been waiting for your call for 6 years now. Mr. Harrison left strict instructions that if you ever contacted us, we were to clear his schedule immediately and see you as soon as you could get here." And something about the way she said it, like I was expected and important and worthy of that kind of priority treatment, made me start crying again right there on the phone. James Harrison's office was in one of the most prestigious buildings downtown, all marble lobbies and expensive art, and the kind of quiet that comes from thick carpets and serious money. And when he came out to greet me personally in the reception area, I was struck by how much he looked like my father might have looked if he'd lived another 20 years. The same kind eyes and gentle smile and air of someone who'd seen enough of life to know that kindness and strength weren't mutually exclusive. He led me into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and photographs covering one wall. And I caught my breath when I saw that several of those photographs showed my father, not in his janitor's uniform, but in business casual clothes, standing at construction sites and ribbon-cutting ceremonies and boardroom tables, looking confident and successful in ways I'd never seen him look during his lifetime. "Your father was one of my dearest friends, and absolutely one of the smartest clients I've ever had the privilege of representing," Mr. Harrison said as we settled into leather chairs around a conference table, and he spent the last 15 years of his life building something extraordinary while maintaining the cover of an ordinary working-class life, because he had very specific ideas about how wealth should be managed and passed down to the next generation. He opened a thick folder and began showing me documents that seemed to come from someone else's life. Entirely. Not the modest existence I thought my father had lived. Estate valuations totaling $6.2 million spread across commercial real estate holdings, partnership stakes in 4 thriving businesses, and liquid assets of $1.8 million sitting in accounts that were waiting for me to claim them. The commercial real estate portfolio alone was staggering 12 properties scattered throughout the downtown area and surrounding suburbs, including, Mr. Harrison said with a slight smile, the building at 450 Commerce Street, where my husband's architectural firm had been leasing office space for the past 3 years, paying $15,000 a month in rent to a property management company that was actually one of my father's holdings, which meant Blake had been unknowingly paying rent to my family for years, while telling me we needed to be careful about money. Dominic had Blake investigated about 3 years ago. Mr. Harrison continued pulling out another folder that was considerably thicker than the first, not because he wanted to interfere in your marriage, but because he wanted to make sure that if Blake ever turned out to be the kind of man Dominic suspected he might be, you would have all the evidence and resources you needed to protect yourself. The surveillance reports and financial documentation that Mr. Harrison showed me next were even more damning than what I'd overheard in Blake's office. Detailed evidence of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, totaling $847,000 shell companies, used to hide the true valuation of his architectural firm, which was actually worth $3.2 million. Rather than the $800,000 he'd claimed in his divorce filings and photographs spanning the past 18 months, showing Blake and Paige having romantic dinners and weekend getaways to hotels and generally conducting their affair with a boldness that suggested they never worried about getting caught because they assumed I was too trusting or too stupid to figure out what was happening right in front of my face. "Your father knew exactly who Blake was, mister. Harrison said quietly, and he built you a legal and financial fortress to protect you from men like that. But he also respected your autonomy enough to let you make your own choices and live your own life until the moment you needed this protection. Which is why his will was structured with specific instructions that it shouldn't be probated until you actively sought it out by going through his belongings, because that would indicate you were facing exactly the kind of crisis he'd prepared for. The final revelation came when Mr. Harrison mentioned almost casually that his wife was Judge Diane Morrison, the same judge who'd been assigned to my divorce case, and while she couldn't show any favoritism or treat my case differently than any other divorce proceeding, she would ensure that all evidence was examined fairly, and that Blake's attempts to hide assets would be exposed to the full extent that the law allowed. And suddenly I understood that my father hadn't just left me money. He'd left me a complete strategy for fighting back against the kind of betrayal that Blake had planned, every piece positioned perfectly, like a chess game that Dominic had been playing for years, even though he couldn't have known exactly when or how it would all come together. The meeting between Ms. Vasquez, Mr. Harrison, and myself felt like a war council planning a campaign against an enemy who had no idea we were even preparing to fight, and there was something deeply satisfying about sitting in that conference room surrounded by documentation of Blake's lies while he went about his day, thinking he'd successfully positioned himself to walk away from our marriage with everything he wanted. Mr. Harrison explained that the timing of revealing my father's will was absolutely critical, that we needed to let Blake present his settlement offer first, so his arrogance and assumptions about my helplessness would be on full display before we dropped the revelation that would destroy every calculation he'd made about how this divorce would proceed. And Ms. Vasquez added that we had leverage beyond just the inheritance, because Blake's deliberate concealment of marital assets was serious enough that we could threaten criminal prosecution if he didn't agree to a settlement that actually reflected the full scope of what he'd tried to steal from me. We spent 3 hours going through every document, every piece of evidence, every legal strategy we might need to counter whatever arguments Blake's expensive attorney might try to make. And Ms. Vasquez kept shaking her head in amazement at the thoroughness of my father's preparation, the way he'd anticipated every possible scenario, and made sure I would have the documentation and resources to prevail, regardless of how skilled Blake's legal team might be. "Your father basically built you a complete legal arsenal," she said, evidence of asset concealment. Proof of adultery, which is still relevant in this state for determining settlement amounts. Documentation of financial abuse and manipulation, and on top of all that, you have independent wealth that completely changes the power dynamic of this divorce, because Blake thought he was divorcing a financially dependent woman with no options, but he's actually divorcing a multimillionaire who has better documentation of his crimes than he has of his legitimate assets. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. I would continue pretending I knew nothing about my inheritance or Blake's hidden assets, maintain the facade of the defeated wife who was just grateful to get whatever scraps her generous husband was willing to offer. And then, at the perfect moment during the court proceedings, Mr. Harrison would reveal my father's will, and Ms. Vasquez would present all the evidence of Blake's fraud, and we would watch as Blake's entire world collapsed in real time when he realized that the woman he'd been mocking and dismissing was actually far more powerful than he'd ever been. The key is making sure he commits to his false financial disclosures before we reveal what we know, Mr. Harrison emphasized, because once he's testified under oath about his assets and income, any discrepancies we can prove become evidence of perjury and fraud, rather than just honest mistakes or differences of opinion about valuation. The weeks leading up to our court date were the strangest period of my entire life, waking up every morning next to a man who thought he was about to triumph over me completely, while I knew with absolute certainty that his victory was actually going to be his total destruction. And there were moments when I almost felt sorry for him, because he genuinely had no idea what was coming. No clue that every confident smirk and condescending comment was just digging his grave deeper. Blake's arrogance reached levels that would have been almost funny if they weren't so painful. like when he asked me to help him pick out furniture for his new place that he was planning to share with Paige, or when he suggested that after the divorce was finalized we could still be friends, because he didn't want things to be awkward when we ran into each other around town, as if the complete destruction of 9 years of marriage was just a minor inconvenience that mature people should be able to move past without any hard feelings. Paige called the house phone one evening and hung up when I answered, but not before I heard her laugh in the background, and Blake's phone lit up constantly with texts that made him smile in ways he hadn't smiled at me in years, and I watched all of this happening while keeping my face neutral and my voice pleasant, playing the role of the soon-to-be ex-wife who was accepting her fate with grace and resignation. I visited my father's grave the night before our court date and sat on the grass beside his headstone, telling him everything, thanking him for loving me enough to protect me. Even after he was gone, apologizing for not understanding how much wisdom there was in his warnings about keeping my own resources and never letting anyone make me completely dependent, and promising him that I would use what he'd given me not just to defeat Blake, but to help other women who found themselves in similar situations, trapped in marriages with men who saw them as property to be managed, rather than partners to be cherished. Blake opened a bottle of expensive champagne that final evening before our court date, toasting to new beginnings and mutual freedom, and I raised my glass and smiled and let him believe that I was as resigned to my fate as he assumed that I had no idea about the offshore accounts or the hidden assets, or the fact that I was actually wealthier than he'd ever been. And when he went to bed early, because he wanted to be well rested for our big day, I stayed up alone in the living room thinking about how my father had known exactly what kind of man Blake was, long before I'd been willing to see it. How he'd built protection for me because he understood that love sometimes makes us blind to truths that should be obvious, and how tomorrow I was going to honor his memory by showing Blake and everyone else in that courtroom that Dominic Winter's daughter was nobody's fool and never had been. I'd just been playing a longer game than anyone realized, Ms. Vasquez's voice cut through the courtroom silence with a clarity that made everyone sit up straighter as she explained to Judge Morrison that due to administrative complications at the probate court that had delayed proper processing of my father's estate for 6 years, we had only recently discovered documentation that materially affected the division of assets in this divorce, and I watched Blake's face transform from smug confidence to confusion, and then to something that might have been the first flicker of real fear as he processed what she was saying. Garrison Powers jumped to his feet immediately with an objection that this was clearly a stall tactic, that I'd had years to bring up any supposed inheritance, and waiting until the day of our divorce finalization was obviously just a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. But Judge Morrison held up one hand to silence him and asked Ms. Vasquez to present whatever documentation she had to support these claims, and the tone in her voice suggested she was very interested in hearing what had been hidden for the past 6 years. Mr. Harrison stood up from where he'd been sitting quietly in the gallery, and I saw Blake's eyes widen in recognition, because apparently he knew who James Harrison was, knew that Harrison and Partners represented some of the wealthiest families and most successful businesses in the city, and the fact that a lawyer of that caliber was involved in what Blake thought was a simple divorce between a successful architect and his financially dependent wife clearly didn't make sense to him. "Your Honor, if I may approach the bench, Mr." Harrison said with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of winning cases that other lawyers thought were unwinnable. "I am the executor of Dominic Winter's estate, and I can provide clarification on the inheritance documentation that has recently come to light, as well as explain why the timing, while unusual, is actually exactly what Mr. Winters specified in his will when he established very particular conditions for when and how his assets should be transferred to his daughter." Judge Morrison gestured for Mr. Harrison to approach, and I saw Blake lean over to whisper frantically to Garrison, his platinum blonde hair falling across his forehead in a way that would have seemed charming once, but now just looked desperate and afraid, and Garrison was shaking his head and shuffling through papers like he might find some magical document that would explain what was happening and give them back the control they'd thought they had over these proceedings. Mr. Winter's estate. Mr. Harrison began addressing the court with the kind of measured calm that suggested he'd delivered this type of bombshell many times before, was valued at the time of his death, 6 years ago, at approximately $6.2 million, consisting of commercial real estate holdings, partnership interests in several successful businesses, and liquid assets, all of which was to be transferred to his daughter Maya under very specific conditions designed to ensure she would receive this inheritance only when she truly needed it, rather than as an automatic transfer upon his death. The number $6.2 million seemed to echo through the courtroom like a gunshot, and I watched Blake's face drain of all color as he processed what that meant, his mouth actually falling open in a way that might have been comical if this wasn't the complete destruction of every plan he'd made for his future. $6 million, Blake finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. That's impossible. Her father was a custodian who cleaned office buildings. He lived in a rent-controlled apartment and drove a 15-year-old truck. There's no way he had that kind of money. Mr. Harrison turned to look at Blake directly, and there was something almost pitying in his expression as he said Mr. Winters was indeed employed as a night custodian for the entirety of his adult life, but he was also one of the most successful commercial real estate investors in this city, and he used his position as a custodian to gather intelligence about business opportunities that other investors never had access to, building a portfolio over 30 years that included, among other properties, the building at 450 Commerce Street, where I believe your architectural firm has been leasing office space for approximately 3 years. The revelation that Blake had been paying rent to my father's estate and therefore indirectly to me for the past 3 years seemed to hit him like a physical blow, and I saw Garrison whisper something urgent in his ear before standing up to request a recess so they could review this new information. But Judge Morrison denied the request with a sharp look that suggested she was very much interested in hearing exactly what else might be revealed about the financial situation in this marriage. Ms. Vasquez stood up next, and I could see the transformation in her demeanor now that she had resources and evidence behind her instead of just the usual losing position of representing a woman with no money against a wealthy husband with expensive lawyers. And she began methodically presenting documentation of Blake's hidden assets, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the shell companies used to conceal the true value of his architectural firm, the systematic transfer of marital assets into accounts and properties that were structured to keep me from having any claim to them in a divorce. Your Honor, Ms. Vasquez said, her voice steady and clear. We have evidence that Mr. Crawford has been planning this divorce for approximately 18 months, during which time he deliberately concealed marital assets, transferred funds to offshore accounts, manipulated business valuations, and engaged in a pattern of financial abuse designed to leave Mrs. Crawford with as little as possible while he retained the wealth they built together during 9 years of marriage. She presented bank records showing transfers totaling $847,000 to accounts in the Cayman Islands that Blake had never disclosed. Business documents showing his firm was actually valued at $3.2 million rather than the $800,000 he'd claimed, and perhaps most damaging of all, emails between Blake and Page discussing their divorce strategy and how they were going to minimize my settlement so they'd have more money to start their new life together. Judge Morrison's expression grew progressively darker as she reviewed each piece of evidence, and when she finally looked up at Blake, her voice was cold enough to freeze water as she asked, Mr. Crawford, are you aware that concealing assets during divorce proceedings constitutes fraud, and that in this jurisdiction such fraud can be treated as a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment? Blake tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound, and Garrison put a hand on his arm to silence him while frantically whispering in his ear about their legal exposure and potential criminal charges, and how badly this situation had deteriorated. Ms. Vasquez wasn't finished, though, and she presented our counteroffer with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from having an unbeatable hand. I would retain all of my inherited assets as separate property, not subject to division. Blake would forfeit every single dollar of the assets he'd hidden as penalty for his attempted fraud. He would pay $250,000 in damages for financial abuse and emotional distress caused by his adultery and deception, and he would cover all legal fees for both sides of this divorce. This is insane. Blake finally found his voice standing up so fast, his chair nearly tipped over. You can't just take everything I've worked for, everything I've built, just because I didn't mention every single account I had. Judge Morrison fixed him with a look that could have melted steel and said in a voice that left no room for argument, Mr. Crawford, you didn't simply fail to mention a few accounts, you deliberately and willfully concealed marital assets, with the specific intention of defrauding your wife of her legal share of the wealth you accumulated during your marriage. You committed perjury in your financial disclosures to this court, and based on the evidence I've seen, you could very easily be facing criminal prosecution in addition to these civil proceedings. So I strongly suggest you sit down, consult with your attorney, and seriously consider that Mrs. Crawford is being extraordinarily generous by offering you a settlement that allows you to keep any assets at all instead of pressing charges that could result in prison time. Blake turned to me. Then, his expression desperate in a way I'd never seen before, all the arrogance and superiority stripped away to reveal someone who finally understood that he'd lost everything he thought he'd won, and he said my name like a question, or maybe a prayer. Maya, please, we were married for 9 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Can't. We work this out like adults instead of destroying each other? And I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every person in that courtroom watching me. Every eye focused on what I would say to the man who'd spent months planning to leave me with nothing while I made his dinners and supported his career and played the role of devoted wife. And I let the silence stretch out for a long moment before I spoke. 9 years, I said, and my voice was steady and clear and stronger than I'd ever heard it before. 9 years during which you convinced me to give up my career to support yours. 9 years during which you took control of all our finances and made me believe we couldn't afford things that you were actually spending on your mistress. 9 years during which you were planning to divorce me and hide everything we'd built together so you could start fresh with someone else while I struggled to survive on whatever scraps you decided to throw me. Blake's face crumpled as I continued. You called me a situation that needed to be managed. You told Paige that I lacked ambition and held you back from your potential. You laughed about how easy it would be to leave me with nothing because I was too trusting to protect myself. And now you want to appeal to those 9 years of marriage like they meant something to you, when we both know the only thing that ever meant anything to you was your own success and your own comfort and your own freedom to do whatever you wanted without consequences. So, no, Blake. I finished those 9 years don't mean anything to me anymore, except as a reminder that my father was right when he warned me never to let anyone make me completely dependent on them. Never to trust someone so completely that I forget to trust myself, and never to believe that love means making yourself smaller, so someone else can feel bigger. And if you'd actually loved me the way you promised to when we got married, you would have known that already, but you didn't. So here we are. 1 year later, Maya stood in the Dominic Winters Community Center watching children from working-class families learn financial literacy and creative skills in bright, welcoming spaces funded by her father's legacy and her own thriving design firm that now employed 15 people and handled campaigns for major clients who valued her vision instead of trying to diminish it. And she thought about how the worst moment of her life had somehow transformed into this beautiful purpose that honored her father's memory while helping countless others avoid the kind of betrayal she'd experienced. Blake had sent an anonymous donation 6 months earlier, the first small gesture toward becoming someone better than the man who'd tried to destroy her. And while Maya would never forgive him completely, she understood that his journey toward redemption wasn't her responsibility to grant or withhold it. was something he had to work out for himself through actions that actually helped others, rather than just words meant to ease his guilt. And she took a certain satisfaction in knowing that his architectural firm was slowly recovering, but would never reach the heights it might have if he'd chosen partnership over betrayal. The legal battle had sparked more than personal victory, though, because Maya worked with Judge Morrison to establish the Financial Protection Initiative, providing free legal counsel and financial education to people facing divorce from manipulative partners, while new legislation requiring full asset disclosure in all divorce proceedings made it harder for others to hide wealth the way Blake had tried to do. And James Harrison's firm now ran monthly workshops teaching people how to protect themselves financially in marriage. And Maya's story became a teaching case in family law courses about justice, resilience, and the importance of building structures that protected the vulnerable instead of just punishing the guilty after damage was already done. Dominic Winters's greatest investment hadn't been the buildings or the businesses or the carefully hidden millions that ensured his daughter's security. It had been the years he'd spent teaching Maya that real power came from knowing your own worth and refusing to let anyone convince her to be less than she was. And that lesson had paid dividends that would last for generations of people who would benefit from Maya's foundation and her advocacy and her unshakable belief that everyone deserved to be valued for exactly who they were, not diminished to make someone else feel powerful. And as she watched children in the center that bore her father's name learn those same lessons, she finally understood what he'd meant when he called her his greatest treasure, because the true inheritance wasn't the money at all. It was the strength to use it for something that mattered. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that they're stronger than they know, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever faced a situation where someone underestimated you, only to discover they'd made a serious mistake, because your stories matter, and your voices deserve to be heard just as much as Maya's did.